will be a discussion from a particular point of view of a very common view that is held today. And this is a particular thesis that is advocated by people who sympathize with scientific naturalism. I think there are other forms of naturalism that could be, depending on how you want to address this issue here. I will only talk about some particular applications of scientific naturalism. That is the view that is characterized, I think, by a couple of principles. The first one is an ontological principle. The world consists of nothing but the entities to which successful scientific explanations commit us. And then, which is more relevant for today, an epistemological principle, scientific inquiry is in principle our only genuine source of knowledge. All other alleged forms of knowledge, like a priori knowledge, or irreducible should be here, moral knowledge or mathematical knowledge, either illegitimate or in principle reducible to scientific knowledge. And this is as a corollary. Ontologically and epistemologically, philosophy has to be continuous with science. There is a famous quotation by Klein, I reach to naturalism and even glory in it, till means banishing the dream of first philosophy and pursuing philosophy rather as a fact-once system of the world, continuous with the rest of science. Notice the rest of science in reference with reference to philosophy. Now, these are many applications. Given the assumption that the world lacks any autonomous, intentional, or normative, or phenomenological facts, there are many programs of naturalization that aims at eliminating the explanations that refer to these alleged facts, without wanting to reduce them to scientifically kosher explanations. And this generates a particular fortune of views like illusionism, fictionalism, error theory, skepticism, nominalism, and mysterianism in reference with the entity, normally intentional phenomenological entities and facts, and with to the connected explanations. This is particularly true of many naturalization projects that are connected with the idea that from the neuroscience or from the theory of evolution, philosophy can gain a lot. My view will be criticizing some of this program, but I don't have any a priori, or less a posteriori, proof that some naturalization projects can't work. I'm open to that. I only think that we need specific reasons to think that one naturalization project is good. There are no a priori or posteriori reasons to think that there have to be successful naturalization projects, at least in principle, for any field in philosophy. I don't think that this is a sound view, or at least it's not a very plausible one. Particularly, I will talk about moral knowledge and about a particular phenomenon, let's say a historical phenomenon, that is the return of emotivism, based on both the theory of evolution and the neurosciences. So some philosophers, scientists think that moral knowledge can be reduced, can be seen through the lenses of emotivism. And this is the mathematical view according to which ethical statements do not express any propositions, and they do not represent anything because they only express emotions. So the origin of this is human through other philosophers, and some people now think that there is some kind of scientific basis for this view. And I will analyze a particular experiment, an article that I think is interesting because it's kind of paradigmatic for this kind of article. There is also a book by Haidt, The Emotional Dog and Its Rational Tail. So the dog is emotional, and that is the tail. Or this is an article that appeared in Science last year. It's called In Bad Taste, Evidence for the Oral Origins of Moral Disgust, where the so-called oral view is defended. And I will have present some criticism of this view. This is part of the article. We tested directly the primitive oral origins of moral disgust by searching for similarity in the facial moral activity evoked by gustatory distaste, elicited by unpleasant tastes, and moral disgust, elicited by unfair treatment in an economic game, the famous ultimatum game. We found that these two states evoked activation of the lateral muscle region of the face, characteristic of a neural muscle rejection response. So it seems that when we dislike something, for kind of food we don't like, we do this, we erase this, delete, but we do the same if we are present in an unpleasant moral situation. These results, look, this is interesting, suggest that immorality elicits the same disgust as disease factors and bad tastes. The same disgust. This is another quotation from the article. Although rationalistic theories of moral psychology have long emphasized the role of conscious reasoning in morality, recent empirical and theoretical work suggests that emotion may also play a key role in moral judgment. And a little more, these newer theories make the claim that moral cognition relies primarily on phylogenetically older affective systems rather than on more recently evolved higher cognitive functions. And then in the article, it's clear that they support the idea that it's not only a question of a phylogenetic story that explains why we are able to give moral judgments, but also that the content of the judgments depends, is constituted by this evolutionist story. So I think that this article gives an evolutionarily plausible account of the biological recognitions for the emergence of the sense of morality, but does it so far claim that emotivism is the right morality? That's a crucial point here. There are some perplexities I have. Okay, now we're looking because otherwise I will be too long, but the idea is that to compare, to imagine a situation in which two individuals with very different ethical perspectives face the same extreme moral situation. The father of a woman who has been in a deep coma for 15 years, kept alive by extreme therapeutic methods, asks for stopping her artificial nutrition, which will certainly cause his daughter's death. This is a real case that happened in Italy a couple of years ago. Now, let's imagine that a judge decides that such decision is correct and orders that it is carried out. When this happens, two individuals are in the woman's hospital room. The first strongly believes in the idea of the sanctity of life, so he sees the implementation of the judge's decision as murder, and therefore as morally repugnant. The second individual, instead, strongly believes in the idea of the dignity of life, so he sees the implementation of the judge's decision as a very desirable act, that is, as morally approvable. According to the experiment and the theory of this article is by Chapman and others, according to Chapman and colleagues, in present the very same situation, only the first individual, the one who believes in the sanctity of life, will have the kind of physical reaction that characterizes moral distaste, while possibly the other will manifest his moral approval with some specific physiological expressions, such as perhaps the distension of his facial muscles or something similar. So what I mean is there are two opposite physiological reactions. Here, of course, it is not relevant what arguments can respectively be given for the two views. Rather, the question that is relevant is how enlightening the evolutionary account given above is in accounting for the moral features of this situation. The answer is, in my opinion, that it is not very much enlightening. First of all, the evolutionary account cannot explain in any way the crucial difference between the two men's conflicting moral perspectives, unless we say that one of the two is sick or is, has a physical problem. If we say that they both defend respectable, acceptable moral views, the evolutionary story doesn't help us in understanding this difference. The context to which they react, these two people react, is exactly the same, but the moral attributes of the two individuals with their respective physiological correlates are opposite. Indeed, there is an essential gap in the above given evolutionary explanation of the source of morality, the one that comes from the history of the phylogenetic history and comes from gustatory states, the same root. What is missing is an explanation of why, in terms of the same situation, of one of the two individuals has a reaction of moral refusal, while the other one has a reaction of moral approval with the respective corresponding physiological expression. The fact that we don't have a convincing evolutionary account of the differences. We don't have a convincing evolutionary account of the differences between these two different ethical perspectives, the one based on the sanctity of life and the one based on the dignity of life, should be no surprise. This remark is analogous to the familiar point that development of culture is in most cases much faster than the development of biological evolution. So the cultural phenomena need different explanantia that the theory of evolution than the ones of the theory of evolution. In particular, the two moral views of the dignity and the sanctity of life have appeared in the human history only recently, no more than 2 or 3 millennia ago. So in order to get a satisfying evolutionary account of a particular biological trait, one needs a much longer time. One has to trace the origin of that trait at least to some dozens of thousands of years ago. So, but more has to be said on this point. It is clear that if the same context causes opposite physiological reactions in two different individuals, these differences, far from being giving a satisfying explanations of the different moral attributes of the subjects, need an explanation. And the such an explanation, I believe, is a cultural one. In our example, the two individuals have opposite moral reactions and consequently different physiological expressions because of their respect. They have different systems of moral values. So the first individual will have a reaction of moral disgust and consequently will raise the lid because he believes in the sanctity of life, and in the scenario I described, life has been profaned in his view. Vice versa, the other individual will have the reaction of moral approval with the related physiological expressions because he believes that the life of the woman was not worth living anymore. The difference in the physiological responses of the two individuals can therefore be explained by referring to their moral and cultural backgrounds. And these backgrounds generate the respective moral reactions and physiological reactions. To put it differently, the direction of the explanatory relevant causal imputation goes from the cultural to the physiological. That is, the cultural factors have to be seen as the causes and the physiological phenomena as the effects. Of course, one can think that even culture as such can be explained in evolutionary terms. But this is a much bigger project. And anyway, culture will make it between the situation and our physiological responses. So the point is that it's not as immediate as people think when they defend the overall moral thesis. The overall moral thesis says that more or less 500 million ago, anemones learned in evolutionary sense to react to poison food. And this food then evolutionarily gave them an advantage and was passed to the next species and to us eventually. And will be the same process. There can be, but the point is if this explains moral behavior. Another interesting point concerns Chapman's opinion that immorality elicits the same disgust as disease factors and characteristics. What does the term same disgust mean here? When I am in front of a kind of food I do not like, let's say pistachio, actually I like pistachio, I think I like every food, so I pick one. If I am in presence of pistachios when I don't like it, I might certainly activate the levator labii muscle region of the face in an expression of disgust, and that's it. But when I'm in front of a situation that I perceive as morally repugnant, besides bracing my upper lip, I would also feel that that situation is wrong. This is a normative component that, while essentially the moral reaction is not present in the gustatory taste. It is not that I think that people who like pistachio are wrong, or that it's good that I don't like it. I don't think so. Therefore, moral disgust has an essential normative component that is not present in the gustatory disgust. For Leibniz's law, these two forms of disgust cannot be considered as identical. They are not the same disgust. The difference between moral and gustatory disgust is clear also if one thinks that we accept the idea that in the case of moral disgust, one should be ready, if requested, to offer reasons in favor of his or her moral views. Of course, the reasons one can offer for one's moral views are sometimes mere post ad hoc rationalizations. What is important, however, is that we certainly recognize the legitimacy of the question, why, in your view, is this action or situation or statement wrong or right? This clearly doesn't happen in the case of gustatory mistakes. If someone asks me why I don't like pistachio, I would not think that this question is a good one. Another weak point of the experiment, and this is very common to this kind of literature, concerns the fact that the so-called ultimatum game is taken to be the prototype of the moral situations and of the agent's reaction to that game are the prototype of our moral attitudes. I won't enter in detail so that everyone knows what the ultimatum game is, but I think that this is very useful in testing the faults of the expected utility theory, but I don't think it works very much as an example of a real moral situation. There are not only moral situations, there are also other factors that are crucially at stake in the reaction of the subjects to unfair distributions of money in the ultimatum game, like considerations of instrumental rationality or the peculiar mental setting caused in the subjects by the awareness that they are part of a scientific experiment witnessed and evaluated by scientists, and all these factors can play an important role. In any case, I don't think that very general conclusions about moral repulsion should be drawn from such a specific and natural situation. All this criticism should, in my view, makes us very suspicious of the idea that, defended by Chapman and the others, that their article may support modernism. But I think there is a better reason. There is another reason. According to Chapman and colleagues, when we are in front of a morally relevant situation, our having the physiological reaction to disgust goes together with our having a moral attitude. This, however, is wrong, since in assuming a moral attitude, it is essential that we can, at least in principle, detach ourselves from our instinctive and immediate reactions. That is, the possibility of a detachment from our instinctive reactions in morally relevant situation is a necessary condition for morality, certainly one of the most crucial. Another example can help us in understanding this point. I think I'm not following very much. Let's imagine that there is a person, John, who grew up in a bigoted environment and was taught racist ethics, one based on the idea that segregation is good, and one should avoid contacts with people of a different skin color. Recently, however, John has become a convinced anti-racist, even if every now and then he has still to fight in order to avoid that the effects of his education condition his behavior. One day, while walking in the street, John encounters a wounded man who asks for help. The man is bleeding, and he is obviously not dangerous, and certainly need to be seen by a doctor. He, however, belongs to a different ethnic group from John's. So, John has an instinctive attitude of repugnance, that is, of moral disgust, and raises his lips. This is because of his education, that conditions him immediately. However, instead, now John believes in a moral system in which there is no place for racist values. So as soon as he realizes that his own racist education is conditioning him, he makes a rational effort to win his repugnance. That is, he forces himself to help the man, notwithstanding his previous instinctive repugnance to do so, because now he knows this is the right thing to do. And this shows, I think, that the facial expressions of disgust do not have to go together with our moral attitudes. In any morally relevant situation, we have to have the possibility to detach ourselves from our instinctive reactions in order to evaluate if they are morally acceptable. Of course, very often they are. In those cases, the moral detachment will confirm the instinctive reactions. But this doesn't happen necessarily. Or sometimes we do not detach, but we should be able to do that if this is a moral situation. The connection between moral attitudes and physiological reactions, therefore, is a very extensive one. We could even imagine a person, I think, that is moral because she always detaches herself from her bad instincts. So, I think that this proves that these evolutionary stories don't really can give us, biological preconditions of our moral capacities, but I don't think that they do much in supporting emotivism. Incidentally, someone would say, okay, but you are defending an anti-Darwinian view. Shame on you. I don't agree with this, and let me quote an authority in the field. A moral being is one who is capable of comparing his past and future actions or motives and of approving or disapproving of them. We have no reason to suppose that any of the lower animals have this capacity. This quotation comes from Charles Darwin's The Descent of Man. So Darwin would agree with me on this issue. Anyway, some other people approach the idea of naturalizing morality from a different route. They take for granted, as Hume, Kant, and many others have done, that morality requires free will. This is a controversial issue. Everyone knows about Frankfurt's counterexamples. That's a kind of a gigantic discussion. I don't want to get into it because it's too big. But let's assume that it's true, as many people still think, that in order to have morality, to have freedom. Many people think that in neurosciences nowadays can prove that freedom is an illusion. This would have consequences for our moral life. And particularly, this is a very interesting article that appeared a couple of weeks ago in Neuroscience. Look at the title, Unconscious Determinants of Free Decisions in the Human Brain. The decisions in the brain speaks clearly. They want to nationalize the national decisions, and they will this is the absolute. There has been a lot of controversy as to whether subjectively free decisions are determined by brain activity ahead of time. We found that the outcome now there will be some fight. Now there will be you will. Okay. So let's try to go back to the experiment. We found that the outcome of the decision can be encoded in brain activity of prefrontal and parietal cortex up to 10 seconds before it enters awareness. This delay presumably reflects the operation of a network of high-level control areas that begin to prepare an upcoming decision long before it enters awareness. The claim of the article is this: there is no objectively free decision that corresponds to the subjectively free decision. So we feel we make decisions that are causally effective. We are wrong. We never control what we do. Our brain does this for us. This is the experiment. Of course, this is considered by many an improvement of the famous experiments by Benjamin Lee. Up to a point, they are an improvement, but not drugs, for instance. Okay, this is the experimental task. Subjects carried out a freely paced motor decision task, while their brain activity was measured using functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI. The subjects were asked to relax while fixating on the center of the screen, where a stream of letters was presented. At some point, when they felt the urge to do so, they were to freely decide between one of the two buttons, operated by the left and the right index fingers, and press it immediately. In parallel, they should remember the letter presented when their motor was consciously made. So the idea of the screen is only to calculate time. The idea that when they realized they made the decision to rest, up to 10 seconds earlier, the experiment already knew that. Okay, that's it. Well, I think that this is interesting compared with Libet for several reasons. Of course, there is an improved technology. They use instead of electron encephalogram, the fMRI, they obtain much more astonishing results, right? Libet was saying that 1/3 of a second before the awareness of the subject, the decision was released. 1/3 of a second. These people say 7 to 10 seconds earlier. Also, in this article, their authors don't present the bizarre theory that Libet used to defend, the idea that we still keep there was going to veto, consciously to veto what our brain decides for us. That's a strange theory, and we won't discuss this now, but they simply go for the illusionist theory, okay? Free will is an illusion. And also the main reason for which I think this is an improvement is because, you remember probably, the experiment set by Libet was this kind. You had to hold your finger, and they said, okay, in the next minute when you want, relax when you want, decide to hold the finger, do it, and you have to look at the clock to know when you decided, and that was after a neurological chain that started, ended in the movement. Okay? But the one with this typical objection was, look, why do you stop the relevant causal chain at the moment in which, there is the neurological event that starts the causal chain that ends in the moment of the finger? There is an intentional event that is previous when the subject accepts to perform the experiment. This is intentional for what we know. So why don't we start the relevant causal chain there? In this experiment, it doesn't work that way because they ask you to make the decisions later. They say, okay, you will have to make the decision in the next meeting. They don't say what decision, what action you have to do. You have to make the decision later. So it's more interesting. Still, at most, this experiment gives some evidence, if we still need it some, that the Cartesian method, the transparency of consciousness, doesn't work. There is from Leibniz, Freud, and cognitive science, we know that much, perhaps everything that happens in our mind is, we can be unaware or wrongly interpreting what happens. Perhaps there is not such a thing as a transparency of consciousness. Still, I think that the fact in itself, in action like this, is something that which we are not completely aware. Perhaps we are, being wrong about how the action is generated. In itself, proves that we are not free. Think about this case. Think that I want to drink during the debate, and then Emiliano asks me a question. So while I think how to reply to this terrible question, I drink and then I answer. And then I wonder, did I drink? And I look, yes I did. I don't know, I didn't realize that I drank. But surely, I think that what I did was intentional because I wanted to. So I would consider that a free action, even if I wasn't aware of when and how it was performed. So the fact that consciousness can be wrong about these issues doesn't in itself prove that actions or decisions are not free. This is a general point. So what I mean is, these kind of experiments are certainly interesting for issues about consciousness, but it's not obvious that they are very relevant for freedom. We need extra research. Okay, there are some typical methodological objections to this kind of experiment, to this and many others, including Libet. First of all, there is kind of they try to put in a parallel the time of neurophysiology, the way that brain causal chains work with the time of consciousness. One doesn't need to be a follower of Husserl to think that the time of consciousness is not temporal. So there are differences there that's not obvious that they can be solved so easily as saying, well, this is when the exact moment in which you have this decision, this is the corresponding mental event. Anyway, also the question is, you have simultaneous. That's very loud. That all these mental events are simultaneous. And this is an objection by Daniel Dennett. You know, this idea that the mind looks at what happens around. So when I look at when I take the decision, it's like a detachment of the consciousness or what the mind or the brain do seems to be very simple practitioner. And then there is a big debate now about the kind of causal correlations that are drawn from these kind of experiments. Because as you know, when we see a neuroimage, we see colors there, but the way these marks are colored is partially arbitrary. There are statistical correlations, and there is this big article here. These are people mostly from MIT, puzzlingly high correlations on MRI studies of emotions, personality, and social cognition. They studied 40 of these experiments and proved that very often the causal correlations were arbitrarily established. You know, they didn't have control experiments. They were very, very slowly. This article was published in major journals. So actually, this critical article had, when it was forthcoming and was on the website, titled "Voodoo Correlations in Social Neuroscience." Voodoo, because you know how it works with voodoo, right? There is something that you don't like. You don't like Berlusconi, you have a picture of Berlusconi, you put a nail in his picture and you will laugh. That's the idea of voodoo. Unfortunately, it doesn't work that way. But according to these people, this is what neuroscientists do. When they go to these fields like social neurosciences, they find correlations that are totally arbitrary. They haven't changed in style because the reactions were furious, but the criticism are still there. Anyway, all this is standard objections. More of them. The first one is the gist of this article is that the decisions that appear to us as subjectively free decisions are not objectively free decisions at all. Well, are they talking about subjectively free decisions? Let's see if this is what they are talking about. Remember, they are talking about this decision. Press the right or the left button, okay? Does this experiment to be a concern free decisions, even if only in the subjective sense? This is interesting because this is what is written in the article, and paraphrase exactly what Libet wrote in his article. That's the way the experiment is set. When the subjects felt the urge to do so, they were completely decided between one of the two buttons. Okay? When they felt the urge to do so. Libet does the same. It's not this way. They need a particular event, right? That is the decision, the urge, let's say. Well, feeling the urge to do something, to make a decision or to make an action. What does it mean? I don't think that feeling the urge to do something, either making a decision or making an action, is performing an action. I think that this is neither necessary nor a sufficient condition for free decision. It's not necessary, of course, because in many cases we are subjectively, we feel we are doing something freely, subjectively at least, we act without feeling an urge to do that. Okay? When we talk, it's not that we feel the urge to say what we say. We say that. Okay? In most cases, I think we don't feel any urge to do what we do. So it's not a necessary condition, and not even a sufficient condition, of course, because now I can feel the urge to sneeze. That's not appropriate. If it does happen, I wouldn't think that that was a free decision, objectively free decision. So feeling the urge to do something is neither necessary nor a sufficient condition of free decision. So there can be an overlapping very little between actions or decisions that are made after feeling an urge. But certainly, if there is such an intersection between the set of free actions and the set of actions we make for actions, or things we do after feeling the urge, okay, this cannot be taken as a paradigm of free decisions in any way. There is more. I think we can even think a moment if really, when you are asked to push one of the two buttons, you are really making a decision. Look, according to the decision theory and common sense, we can take our decision making if and only if in a situation of uncertainty, we have different possibilities. In agent chooses the action she thinks will be best given her preferences. This is crucial. The fact that you talk about decisions when you have preferences. Say, what is the preference I have when I push a button? I do not care. I will personally use the right hand. It's not real preferences at stake. So this is not a genuine decision. I'm not surprised that this is an automatic gesture. I do it automatically. I don't think about it. I don't care. So I don't think it's even. So you remember the title of the article? So 3 decisions in a human person. 3 decisions. There are no 3 decisions at stake. No 3 nor decisions. Finally, the last objection is this. Let's grant that the experiment is correct. Okay? That they prove that we do what we do. Let's say that this is how we make decisions in general. Okay? Let's grant this one. What theory of free will is corroborated by this experiment? Let's see. Certainly illusions. They want to corroborate illusions. If the experiment is correct, when I doubt, illusionism is corroborated. The only thing I would add is that, why is it corroborated? Because we see that we are determined. And this is the past. We are determined that we need neurophysiology to know that we are determined. Physics was enough. Microphysics, theory of relativity is a deterministic field. So why should we be so happy if we are illusionists that we have a neurophysiological proof of determinism? We have the theory of relativity. Second, and crucial, people seem to forget these kind of experiments when they are so happy about illusionism that there is a venerable philosophical theory that is compatibilism, according to which freedom is compatible with determinism. And according to many, Hume is one, or Eger, actually determinism is a necessary condition of freedom. So if an illusionist should be happy about this experiment if it works, so should a compatibilist. They would be happy. They would say, okay, either, standard compatibilists would say, okay, we are compatible, determinism is compatible with freedom, where is the problem? It's so-called super compatibilists. People would think that freedom requires determinism, would be very happy. So, and this is a theory of freedom. It's not an illusionist theory. It's a positive theory of freedom. But it's more surprising that even libertarians will be happy with this experiment. So, two different views. One is causal libertarianism. John Sorlot's defended it. He says there are in the brain undetermined events that are relevant, causally relevant in our decisions, and this is why we are free. Now, this it's an old view that encounters problems, of course, because as Hume said, it seems that indeterminism does not amount to freedom, but it amounts to randomness. But besides that, Sorlo offers arguments for which indeterminism is a necessary condition of freedom. Now, how to fit this view with the experiment? Well, if you look at the experiment, and especially, the discussion of the experiment in the appendix, you find that the accuracy of the predictions is 60%. Only 60% of the cases, they are able to predict what the decision will be. 60% is relevant statistically, because it's 10% more than 50%, but certainly this 40% openness to an indeterministic defender of freedom, like assert to say, okay, this is not epistemological, it's ontological. This is a quantum indeterminacy is magnified by complex phenomena, complexity, or something like that. Strange, odd, physical story, but still it's a consistent one, and it's consistent with the fact that this experiment is not real proof that we are determined, because the space of indeterminacy is very high. 40%. Is it epistemological or ontological indeterminacy? That's a crucial point. And then conceptual, called conceptual libertarianism, can be a little tricky, but it's used like Kant or McDowell nowadays. People who think that the realm of freedom is something unconnected conceptually with, is different conceptually, incommensurable with so-called conventional, irreducible to the physical level. So there is the level in which we talk about agency and the level in which we talk about physics or science. And these are different, they cannot be put together. So this view is impermeable to this kind of experiments, can only be attacked on the conceptual level. Of course, I'm not saying that it's correct, but they won't be shaken very much by this kind of experiment. And finally, this is a view that Chomsky and McGee and then Reagan have defended. They say, oh, freedom is a mystery. And, you know, whatever, the fact that, you know, even this experiment is compatible with the three previous clearest proofs for these people that it is a mystery, it will remain a mystery. As Ben Reagan says, Ben Reagan writes something funny, he says, you know, I think it's a mystery, it will always be a mystery. Or at least, I haven't solved it. That's, you know, an evidence that it's a eternal mystery. But, so these people really won't be shaken by this experiment. So finally, I think that much work has to be done, not only at the political level, but also at the conceptual level, by people who think that morality, free will, and so on will be, all the issues connected to this field will be solved by using the neurosciences. Thank you.
In his paper, Caro illustrates a very general divide between participants in the philosophical debate about the phenomena we ordinarily conceptualize through materialistic terms. He constructs this divide as a contrast between scientific naturalism and liberalized naturalism. I think it's correct. Probably you can use this label. Now, I want to point out that throughout this paper, Mario shows that handy and convenient as it is, the label scientific naturalism is indeed potentially misleading, in that it might suggest that the relevant kind of naturalism, that is scientific naturalism, has science on its side, whereas it is at least doubtful that this is so. Caro, in fact, examines some scientific findings, experiments by Libet, by Sun and colleagues, and by Chapman and colleagues, taken by some to prove certain reductionist and eliminationist conclusions about morality and free will, and offers a range of considerations and arguments to the fact that not only these experiments do not in fact prove the conclusions at issue, but these arguments are utterly irrelevant to the question they are taken to set. I don't have any interesting objection to level against Caro's paper, since I share his general perspective, that is a point of view according to which, on the one hand, a genuine naturalism does not require commitment to the ontological and epistemological primacy of natural sciences, and, on the other hand, rejection of this thesis does not involve any challenge to acknowledge scientific theories, such as evolutionism. What I'm going to do in the time at my disposal is trying to expand a little on what he has already said by putting touched in connection with Chapman's and in connection with the experiments by Chapman and colleagues, and in particular on Chapman's and colleagues' tenet that, I quote, immorality elicits the same disgust as disease vectors and bad tastes, end quote. A first observation is related to Caro's remark that there is a weak interpretation of the conclusion of Chapman's experiments, that is an interpretation according to which the biological conditions for the possibility of moral life, that is the disposition to respond to certain circumstances with the activation of the levator labii muscles region of the face, have evolved through natural selection, and that experiments about moral disgust can therefore tell us something about the origin of moral life. Caro, rightly, in my view, points out that this weaker interpretation is not the one favored by the authors of the study, since they suggest that a phylogenetic account is an essential part not just of an explanation of where morality comes from, but it is an essential part of an explanation of what morality consists in. As I said, I think this remark is less correct, but I would add, as Caro does not, that even the weaker interpretation of Chapman's thesis is problematic. The formulation of the thesis that Chapman and colleagues claim to have tested with their experiment straightforwardly assumes that the wide variety of phenomena we characterize as moral is to be traced to the same unique underlying mechanism, namely an auto-reaction associated with oral disgust. It is, of course, possible that our practical rationality has intelligible precursors in reactions that are proper to sub-rational forms of life, such as the tendency to refrain from substances with bad taste. But I don't see why we should limit these reactions that function as basis for moral life to gustative revulsion. Reactions such as gustative revulsion are among those behaviors that express emotions, and emotions have often been taken by philosophers to be relevant to our moral life, both at the level of organization of our personal lives and at the level of our social institutions. Caro has already recalled a couple of names in the tradition. I would add from Stuart Mill and Rousseau that gave a lot of prominence to emotions in moral life, and more recently, Martha Nussbaum. Nussbaum, in particular, has discussed moral disgust at length, but none of the authors I have mentioned has suggested that disgust is the only emotion that is relevant to moral life. Moral disgust is an important phenomenon, but it is by no means as pervasive as Chapman's thesis wants it to be. Immorality is a wide notion that applies to rape, necrophilia, as well as to tax evasion and waste of plastic containers or polluting detergents in one's household. I would not say that these last behaviors elicit moral disgust on my part, however harsh my moral condemnation of these actions might be. What I'm driving at is the idea that not just disgust, but also fear and anger, as well as shame, jealousy, and many other emotions, with their evolutive ancestors, are important for an understanding of moral life, able to account for the continuity between rational moral beings and suprarational non-moral beings. Or, in other words, for any account that wants to avoid a scenario in which morality shows up out of nowhere. The idea that all moral judgments and reactions must be traceable to the phenomenon of moral disgust strikes me as manifesting a characteristic attitude of scientific naturalism that consists in striving for simple explanation able to accommodate disparate phenomena in an homogeneous picture, whereas reflection on moral disgust might require us to take into account the differences among the various domains in which we apply moral concepts and perceive piecemeal. A second point I want to make is a comment on a quotation from Chapman's article, which Caro has included in his paper. The quotation is, although rationalist, I start with the quotation, although rationalist theory These newer theories make the claim that moral cognition relies primarily on phylogenetically older affective system rather than on more recently evolved higher cognitive functions. End quote. This passage assumes that emotion is, as such, alternative, as it were, to conscious reasoning, as if emotion were constitutively impenetrable to rationality. As Nussbaum has noticed in her Hiding from Humanity, emotions are not devoid of thought. She invites us to imagine a creature such as a shellfish which is completely unable to thought, and at the same time to attribute to this creature emotions relevant to moral life, such as fear and anger. I think this mental experiment is quite effective in eliciting the intuition that in acquiring rationality, we do not just widen the class of stimuli that elicit our reaction, such as that of disgust, to include, for instance, unfair treatment in an economic game, besides bad tastes. It is the emotional reaction itself that is changed by the acquisition of rationality. It is something we cannot intelligibly credit a non-rational creature with. Most emotions relevant to moral life are not satisfactorily described as sudden momentary impulses or complexes of micro-movements, such as the activation of lateral region of the face or a tap of the foot. The subjective character of emotion constitutively involves the thoughts about the situation which evoke them. Grief, anger, disgust, bitterness, shame, regret are all characterized both by typical, even if not universally present, physical signs and by certain sort of thoughts which do not simply accompany those feelings but are part of the experience of those emotions. If this is so, the point that emotions are central to morality can be accommodated while at the same time accepting what I take to be the main point made by Caro, namely that moral attitudes are constitutively questionable, while the motor reaction we share with non-linguistic animals are not. The capacity of experiencing the emotions relevant to our moral life is neither older nor lower than the capacity to test how reasonable our attitudes are by opening them to criticism. A certain kind of emotion and rational debate are aspects of the same complex of capacities.